Everybody, now let us take up hormonal regulation of menstrual cycle. Dear students, in my last lecture you have studied about the menstrual cycle. Now how this menstrual cycle is regulated by hormones, hormonal control, hormonal regulation. Let us talk about it. There are mainly 4 hormones which are regulating the menstrual cycle. They are follicle stimulating hormone FSH, luteinizing hormone LH, then estrogen, mainly the estradiol, and then progesterone. So these are the 4 hormones which are important, or the major hormones which regulate the menstrual cycle in human female. Now let's try to understand how the levels of different hormones change during different phases of the menstrual cycle and how they bring about the changes. Okay. Now first let us take up the graphical representation. Graphical representation, it's here, of the changes in LH and FSH, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. If you look at the graph here, the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone both are in lower concentration in the beginning, that is during the menstruation phase. And again here what we see is FSH is slightly declining and LH is gradually increasing during the menstruation phase. Then both the hormones, their levels, which we measure in terms of units per liter, okay, and so these 2 hormones in the blood, their level, if you measure it, go on increasing. As we see here, it will reach the peak level, say, of the follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They reach to the peak level. The LH reaches almost 40 units per liter mark, 40 unit per liter mark, okay, just before day 14, okay, a few hours before the 14th day or mid cycle of the menstrual cycle. Okay, now this high level or peak level of LH is called as LH surge, and this LH surge is known to trigger ovulation. So it will make the Graafian follicle rupture and release the oocyte, which is in secondary oocyte stage. So that is how the ovulation is triggered by the increased level of LH. Along with that, levels of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and even estrogen also increase. Now after the ovulation, what we see is the hormonal levels are declining. Both LH and FSH, they decline. Their concentration becomes again less, or within 10 units per liter. Okay, so from 40 units per liter or slightly less in case of FSH, now the levels of these 2 hormones have come down to below 10 units per liter. Okay, so this is how the graph here shows from day 1 to day 28 how the levels of these 2 hormones change, and their increased levels are responsible for ovulation. Now let us take up another graph where we see the estrogen and progesterone level, how these two change. Okay. Now here the red line indicate the changes in the estrogen level, and the blue one the levels of progesterone. Now if you look at this graph, what we see, the level of estrogen also is low during the menstruation phase. In the follicular phase it gradually increases, and all of a sudden just before 14th day there will be highest peak level of estrogen, maybe around 30 picomoles per liter. This E refers to estrogen, and the levels of the estrogen in the blood are measured in terms of picomoles per liter. And after the ovulation we see that the estrogen levels decline again, first increasing and then declining, and a little considerable level is still maintained even after the ovulation. But look at the progesterone level. Progesterone levels are very, very minimum in the beginning, all through the menstruation and follicular phase. Okay, and after the mid-cycle day, after 14, that is after the ovulation, we see that the levels of progesterone increase, reaching the highest peak level. And this happens maybe on day 21, the levels show the highest concentration of, or the peak level of progesterone. Okay, and this is indicative of the phenomenon that is called as luteinization, formation of corpus luteum from the already ovulated graphene follicle. So that corpus luteum starts producing the progesterone after the ovulation, that is. So therefore after the ovulation, during the luteal phase or secretory phase, we see that the progesterone level increases. Now suppose after 21st day also there is no implantation, no pregnancy, then what we see, the levels of progesterone come down, decline completely. Progesterone is withdrawn. Why it is withdrawn? Yes, what happens if there is no pregnancy? The corpus luteum undergoes shrinkage and it forms the corpus albicans, and that's why the progesterone secretion will be stopped, and therefore we see here the curve coming down. Just assume that the ovulated egg is fertilized, implantation has taken place, and pregnancy begins. Then what happens? Then this level of the progesterone is maintained constant throughout the pregnancy, and the progesterone remains healthy. It will not undergo shrinkage or degeneration. So till 9 months, till the completion of the pregnancy, the progesterone will be secreted. Progesterone will be continuously secreted in large quantities from the corpus luteum, and we have already studied that it is anti-myometric. It will not allow any contractions in the wall of the uterus, and that helps in maintaining the pregnancy. Is that clear? Okay, now we have seen how the levels of follicle stimulating hormone, then luteinizing hormone, and then the estrogen and progesterone, these levels change. We also seen the measurement, how we measure. We have seen that estrogen is measured in terms of picomoles per liter, but for progesterone it is the nanomoles per liter. There is a relation between these two, as we see here. 1 nanomole equal to 1000 picomoles. So these are the very, very little minimum tracer quantities these are, Okay, in picomoles and nanomoles, these hormones are measured, and these levels we have seen here how they change. Okay, so the change in the hormonal level is responsible for all the changes what we see during the menstrual cycle, and mainly when these hormones like the FSH, LH and estrogen, their levels increase to highest concentration, then what we see is all these three synergistically affecting and bringing about the ovulation. Okay, now let us see regulation of the menstrual cycle by various hormones and their levels we are seeing. Now let us look into it further in detail. Here I have made some ray diagrams to show. Sometimes in NEET and all they are asking about the negative feedback, positive feedback of the hormones. So I have taken up here some additional information. Let us go through that. During the first, if you take up during the menstrual phase, what is happening? Okay. From the hypothalamus, as we see here, the GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, will be released, and that will stimulate the anterior pituitary. And anterior pituitary gland produces FSH and LH, and this is in low levels. We have to remember first, they are secreted but in low levels. And these hormones FSH and LH, they will be positively stimulating the ovarian follicles, okay, bringing about the release of the ovarian hormone, mainly estradiol, which is a type of estrogen, and that's also in the low level. Remember, estrogen is released but in less quantities, and this lower levels of the estradiol or estrogen will have a negative feedback on the hypothalamus. This negative sign what you see here is showing negative feedback. Okay, that means it will not allow the release of GnRH in large quantities, smaller quantities, so that lower levels of FSH, LH, that is maintained. Okay. Now because of that, what is happening? Let us see. Under the low levels of estradiol, endometrium is stimulated, and it is the menstruation phase, the first 5 days of the menstrual cycle, in which we have seen earlier that the endometrium is already broken up, right? And then this estrogen or the estradiol, which has effect on the endometrium. What is that effect? It will cause vasoconstriction. So at the base of the endometrium, basal part of the endometrium is not lost, that is retained. There, where the blood vessels are entering into the mucosa of the endometrium, at that point the blood vessels undergo constriction, vasoconstriction we call, they become narrow, so reducing the blood flow into the endometrium further. Okay, so whatever blood is there, when these constrict, whatever blood remains in the arteries and veins in the endometrium, that only will be lost. No loss of extra blood from the body. So that's very important point, that vasoconstriction takes place, and therefore only 30 ml to maximum 130 ml is what the amount of blood lost during the menstruation phase of a woman. So that's how after the constriction of the blood vessels, we see that the remaining part of the blood vessels in the endometrium gets degenerated, all that tissue breaks up and menses takes place. Clear? Now if you look at one diagram I have drawn here. Yes, this is the female reproductive system as we know. Myometrium, the muscular layer of the uterus. Endometrium, this is thick endometrium, well developed endometrium, as you can see here, thickness of the endometrium. Maybe say after day 14th up to day 21 or up to day 26 it will be maintained. Later on what happens, let us see. And of course this is cervix, this is cervix, and this is vagina. Now look at this. What has happened? The endometrial lining is broken and blood vessels are destroyed. So we see here that the broken endometrium and blood leaves out through the vagina, that is menses. Okay, that's how the menstruation is taking place. Now coming back to our hormonal regulation topic. Okay, now we have seen during the menstruation how the low levels of FSH/LH and low levels of estradiol will help in bringing about the menstruation. And one more thing we have to note here, that the low levels of FSH and LH also stimulate large number of follicles to grow. So follicular phase begins and the low levels of FSH and LH stimulate many follicles. Remember that word, many follicles start growing at once. Clear? Then now let us take up what happens during follicular phase. Hypothalamus is releasing the hormone, that is GnRH, as we know. GnRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary, and here there is a higher levels of FSH and LH released. And these, why the higher levels are being maintained? It is because of the positive feedback. If you go down there, the higher levels of estradiol produced or the estrogen produced, right, that will have the positive feedback, and that makes the, or that keeps the hypothalamus stimulated always, and GnRH is produced in large quantities, and higher amounts of the FSH and LH will be released from the anterior pituitary, and they have the positive effect on the ovarian follicles. So what we see here, that the ovarian follicles are stimulated by FSH and LH, so that higher levels of estradiol are maintained. And these higher levels of estradiol or estrogen is positively controlling, or positive feedback mechanism is there by which the higher levels of FSH and LH are maintained. And the main important thing what we have to observe here is when there is higher level of both FSH and LH, that will stimulate a single ovarian follicle. So that means many ovarian follicles which were already begin to grow and they were on the way of primary, secondary, tertiary, like that levels. So most of them or all of them except one, they will be arrested, their growth will be arrested. Some chemicals produced from the Graphian follicle will not allow these other follicles to grow. Only one follicle under the higher levels of FSH and LH will be allowed to reach the Graphian follicle stage. Okay. Now, so ovarian follicles go on producing estradiol, which is in higher levels, and much of the estradiol or estrogen is produced from the fully mature Graphian follicle now, because this is the follicular phase we are looking into. And this estradiol will stimulate the endometrium also, and what we see here is the endometrium becomes highly thick. So under the influence of the higher levels of estrogen or estradiol hormone, endometrial thickening takes place. Clear? Now, another function we see is that when there is surge of LH and increase in FSH and estradiol, what we see inside the ovaries, the Graphian follicle ovulates and releases the oocyte. That is secondary oocyte surrounded by zona pellucida, zona radiata, and this cumulus ophorus also. Cumulus ophorus, as we see here. So this is how the ovulation takes place on 14th day of the follicular phase. Okay, with this the follicular phase will be ending, and also ovulation has taken place. Ovulatory phase also is over now. Okay, so ovulation is brought about under the LH surge. Now finally, let's take up what happens during the luteal phase. Again the same thing, hypothalamus producing the GnRH that stimulates the anterior pituitary, and that will produce the LH and FSH, positively bringing about its action on corpus luteum. Okay, now here what corpus luteum does, let us see. Corpus luteum, under the influence of LH mainly, and FSH actually helps indirectly, it will increase the receptors for LH in the corpus luteum. Do you understand? There are receptors on the endocrine gland on which the particular hormone comes and binds and pass on the message. Like here, if the corpus luteum has to produce the progesterone, there is a receptor for LH on the surface of the cells of corpus luteum. Those receptors will be increasing under the influence of FSH, so that more prominent effect of the LH can be seen on the corpus luteum. Therefore, both the hormones are shown here. Both the hormones are shown here, bringing about action on the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum produces progesterone as well as little amount of estradiol also. Okay, major hormone is progesterone. Other than that, we have seen inhibin, then relaxin at the parturition time, and here in the normal menstrual cycle time during the luteal phase, little amount of estradiol also is being produced from the corpus luteum. Now this progesterone will have its effect on myometrium of the uterus, that is muscular wall of the uterus, and that makes the contractions of the uterus ceased, or contractions stop, and the uterus assumes static phase, and the attached embryo, the implanted embryo, will be maintained, and the pregnancy will be maintained as such. Okay. Now if there is no implantation, okay, there is no pregnancy, what happens? As we know, the corpus albicans is formed by shrinkage of the corpus luteum, and then the progesterone level decline, no progesterone, then it leads to breakdown of the endometrium. Clear? So that is how the corpus luteum is regulating the luteal phase along with the estradiol and inhibin. Now let us look into some other hormones and their effect, like inhibin here. Inhibin produced from the corpus luteum will stimulate the anterior pituitary, and it is having a negative feedback, means stops the release of FSH and LH, mainly FSH. Okay, so that is further, when these hormones are not needed, these have to be stopped. So that is happening because there is no pregnancy. Okay, there is no implantation, no pregnancy, no need of the more progesterone being released. Clear? So no need to have any further stimulation of corpus luteum from the pituitary hormone. So therefore inhibin makes sure that the release of FSH and LH is stopped. Then progesterone also has the negative feedback on the hypothalamus. Even the GnRH release also will be brought under control or minimized. Now estradiol, which is also released from the corpus luteum, it promotes further development of endometrium if there is fertilization has taken place. So implantation takes place and pregnancy results. Okay, and that is how what we see is during the pregnancy the higher levels of the progesterone and also the estradiol are maintained, but compared to the progesterone, estradiol will be less, estrogens will be lesser than the progesterone, and that low levels of the estrogen is important to further strengthen the endometrium for supporting the growing embryo. Is that clear, students? Now let us go through the points which I have written down there. I have typed some of the points just to summarize what we have now discussed so far. Let's take up. As we know, GnRH from the hypothalamus stimulate pituitary gland to release FSH and LH. So FSH stimulates growing follicles to produce estrogen or estradiol, and LH stimulates corpus luteum to secrete progesterone. Thus, therefore, we see that FSH, LH, estrogen and progesterone which are the 4 hormones responsible for the menstrual cycle. Now during menstrual phase or menstruation phase, FSH and LH are at low level, as we have seen. Yet what we see is FSH is declining and LH is increasing within low limits, of course. Then both LH and FSH will reach the peak level in the mid-cycle day, that is on 14th day or just before 14th day. And likewise, estrogen levels also reach the peak level. Okay. Then we see that LH surge is stimulating the Graphian follicle, which ruptures, releasing the secondary oocyte. So that's what we call ovulation. So we have seen now the hormonal regulation during the follicular phase, starting with the menstruation phase, then follicular phase, and then ovulatory phase. Now luteal phase, if we take up, remaining part of the Graphian follicle gets transformed into corpus luteum, as we have studied, and large amount of progesterone is being released. Progesterone maintains the thick endometrium and prepares the uterus for implantation or attachment of the embryo, and myometrium becomes static, stops the myometrial contractions. And if there is no fertilization, corpus luteum shrinks and progesterone level will be sharply declining, as we know, because the corpus luteum will be changing into corpus albicans. It shrinks and forms the corpus albicans. Then increased levels of estrogen during follicular phase helps in what? Proliferation, that is growth of endometrial tissue. After ovulation, yes, progesterone level increases, but estrogen level declines and certain low levels are maintained. So that's what about the regulation of menstrual cycle by the help of the hormones, hormonal regulation. I hope you have understood these things. Keep studying well, be in touch with subject. I'll be back with the next topic. Bye bye.